At the Center for Teaching and Learning, one of the issues that we're interested in, because we know faculty are interested in it, is assessments. When we're remote teaching, how can we create assessments that are fair and meaningful? How can we do that for 50 people? How can we do that for 150 people? How can we do that for 750 people? We're also thinking that this interest in assessments will carry on. It'll be important for us to think about assessments in our courses for this term, but also next year when, fingers crossed, knock on wood, a few more of us are in physical classrooms. So I believe this to be an ongoing issue. I think not the beginning, but the continuation of a longer conversation at our institution about assessments. So to keep that conversation going, we've invited two people to show off their courses that they teach. So next week, I believe next Monday, we're having Sally Chivers in to talk about the courses that she's been working on and how she thinks about assessments in those courses. But this week, today, we have the real pleasure of having Holly Bates share her work with us. And you know that Holly's from biology. Holly's teaching is astounding. You know Dana Capel? Dana Capel is now in the CTL. And when we were thinking about who to invite to talk about online courses, Holly's name was mentioned, and it was one of those immediate responses that gives reassurance. Yes, Dana said, Holly would be great. Students love her courses, and she's doing incredible work in her courses, even or especially when she's teaching first-year courses in anatomy to 700 or more. I think that's a paraphrase of Dana, but it's pretty close. And you know Dana to being fairly even-keeled. So to get that kind of register on emotional seismograph, I think was pretty reassuring. And that encouraged me to get in touch with Holly, and we had a great conversation before this meeting about how she organizes her courses, and I wanted to bring that to everybody else. Now, Holly's going to not start by talking about her first year course. I believe, Holly, you're going to talk about your fourth year course on Pathophysiology of Disease. And she's going to give us a quick overview of that course, but then really focus on, I believe, Holly, you're going to really focus on assessments. And then maybe we'll make some links back to that first year course. But Holly, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to hear more, see more about your work. Really happy for this.
Well, thank you, Joel, for inviting me to be here, and I'll have to thank Dana for all of those lovely words. She's wonderful. Yeah, so I wasn't sure how to organize things, so I tried to put together a little bit of it's not really a presentation, but just to try to make sure I remember to tell you everything that I have to say, because I thought I'd focus on the use of case studies, because I teach a lot of the biomedical related courses. And of course, that is one of the, I think, best ways to really sort of consolidate what the students are learning, is to try to use a case study and try to apply all of the knowledge that they're learning. So, and that's why we were going to look at the Pathophysiology of Disease course, because essentially the basis of this fourth year course is to take all of the physiology knowledge that they have learned before this time and start to use that knowledge to try to figure out what is going wrong in disease, right? So various diseases. So, and in order for them to do that, they need to be able to apply what they already know and understand. So, so that's why I thought I'd start with that course with pathophysiology. So I'm sure most of you are already aware of what a case study is, but just in case you're not really comfortable with what a case study is, they're very commonly used in many different fields. So they can be used in economics, for example. I, of course, use them as biomed examples, but really what they are, they're stories that are used as a teaching tool to help show the application of a theory or a concept to the real world situations. And so for my students, that's really important, because with this course, with the fourth year pathophysiology course, many of these students, whether they are biomed students or pre-med students, they they have a goal of either going to medical school, going to graduate school, but really going further with their studies where they need to start applying and really critically analyzing what they're learning. So that's why I use a lot of case studies. I use them in actually on reflection, I use them in every single course I teach. The one I use them the most in, of course, is the Pathophysiology of Disease, the 4th year course. So why do I use them? So I use them because, as I said, case studies really cause those students to step out of their comfort zone and really have to apply what they're learning. And sometimes it's difficult to make them do that with a lot of assessments. So rather than just assessing what they're understanding, they need to take it another step further. And then I've also found that when I use these as assessments, they're a pretty good way of discriminating between the stronger and the weak students. So the students that do put in their time to do the assignments, to really read about them, take the time to understand what we're learning in terms of content in the lecture, they usually do really well. And those that don't put in the effort don't do as well. So I find that they're a good way of discriminating between those students, because sometimes the assessments don't do a great job of that. Now with anything, there's always challenges. So I wanted to bring those up as well, because of course, these are things that might sort of hinder you from wanting to use case studies in your teaching. So they can be time consuming in terms of preparation. And Brandon, who TA'd this course last semester, can probably vouch towards the marking of the case studies. And I think that in order to use them really effectively, you need to use scaffolding in the course. So you want to sort of warm the students up to the idea of reading case studies and how you start to dig into these case studies. And so in the pathophysiology class, we do a lot of case studies. So in that way, they do sort of build on it through the course, their skills in analyzing these case studies. And then the last one, which I think is a concern with most assessments, especially the online assessments now, is that the concern with cheating, right? So some ways that I have found that I use to try to minimize these challenges. So for one, I will recycle case studies that I've used previously, but I'll often use them for a different purpose. So for example, if I've used it for a exam worth a lot of marks one year, the next year I might use it in a seminar where it's a lot more of a, instead of an independent assignment, there's a lot more discussion. So it's not as big a deal if they've found the answers somewhere. In terms of scaffolding, as I already mentioned, I will throw in questions during the lectures. So a question, so, okay, let's think about this. And I will, describe a scenario and have them think about that scenario and dig a little bit deeper. So it's a very tiny little case study, but it's still sort of starting to think of things in that manner, that critical manner. And in terms of cheating, I've found try not to use case studies from textbooks. The answers are out there. Of course, I learned that the hard way. If you are using a published case study, again, this is where it comes into the time-consuming part, but if you're using one, try to change enough of the parameters that the students can't look it up. So one of my favorite things is I will change the name of the doctor to Doctor Who, and the patient might be Tina Turner, or something that if they try to Google that question, they're going to get a million hits that have absolutely nothing to do with this case study. So those are just some of the little things that I learned to do now, and it seems to make a pretty big difference. So I'm going to bring you to the course. So Pathophysiology of Disease, which is a 4th year course in the biology department. As I mentioned, many of the students are ones that are looking to go into medicine or dentistry or some sort of biomedical profession. When I started teaching the course 5 years ago, there was 40 students. This year with online, it was a bit bigger than usual. It was 120 students with still a few more on the wait list. So how I've delivered the course has had to sort of change over the years to accommodate the numbers. And in this class, I use the case studies, as I mentioned, in many different places. So I actually use them as small assignments just for practice. So these are ones like the ones that I might do in lecture. They have seminars, which are case study based. Then they have problem sets, which are more independent, although I know they work together. I encourage them actually to work together on their problem sets. And then a final take-home exam where it was also a case study based exam this year. So, okay, so this is the Blackboard course for Pathophysiology of Disease. And this is the nice, neat student view. And so I'm just going to scroll down to show you the course schedule, because I think this is a way of really showing how the course is organized. So this course is broken up into 3 units. So each one of those units has a test. And this was just a traditional multiple choice online test. Through the course, there's also 2 problem sets. So I'll show you an example of what one of those problem sets are. And the problem sets were based on, the first half was a case study, a small case study, but a case study nonetheless. And then the second part was more of a getting them to develop their own experiments, because that was another part of this course, which was a grant proposal. So I won't touch on that too much, but that's what the problem sets were. And then they also had 5 seminars through the semester. And so some of those are more methodology-based seminars, and some of those are case study-based seminars. So I'll show you one of those case studies that we used, which was one on asthma. And so I will just start with that, going to our seminars. And so actually, I'm going to show you 2 of them. So I'll start on this one, the 3rd seminar, which is an asthma attack. So this is a case study that I got from a website. It's the National Center for Case Study Teaching and Science. So this is through the University of Buffalo. And this is a really great resource. So they actually have more than 800 case studies available. And the reason I love them is, for one, they are case studies that have been submitted and reviewed by peers for authenticity. Secondly, they require a subscription. So I don't like that they require money, but the fact that they require money means that only people who really want to get access to these answer keys can. They need to pay for it. And then it is also vetted. So they do vet who they give access to the website to make sure that they are actually teaching faculty. And then they also have very strict rules about sharing the answer keys. So these are all things that I think, especially as you're using things that might be out there on the web, we don't want the answers to be out there, because of course, students won't benefit if they just find the answers somewhere as opposed to thinking them through. So, so this is a case study that's all put together. And so it's got sort of different parts to it. A lot of the ones that I use are these sort of interrupted almost case studies where they will have a few questions to answer and in different parts. So this year, the way that we did this was that they had this case study, and at the seminars, Brandon put together a wonderful presentation to sort of go through some of the techniques and some of the background of the case study without actually answering the questions for them. And he organized some breakout groups for them to discuss different concepts within the case study. And then for the actual assessment part, they were randomly asked to submit 5 answers. So if I just scroll through all of this case study, you'll see that there's lots of questions that they can be asked. So they are expected to do all of the case study, but they will only be asked to submit answers to 5 of those questions. But I set it up as a test in Blackboard so that it was random which questions they were asked. And so in that way, they wouldn't know which ones they needed to submit. So they might as well just go through and do the entire case study. So that's how we set it up this year with the online remote learning, I should say. But in previous years, I have used this in seminars as well. And instead of having it that way, what I had students do was come to class with some of the questions answered, usually the first part answered, and then the rest of it, they would break up into groups and answer the questions and then present and discuss their answers to their seminar section. So that's how I've used them when we can do the seminars in a face-to-face fashion. And then with remote, it was just a little bit different.
Excuse me, Holly.
Yeah.
Did you find like where they only had to, there was still a lot of questions, but they only actually had to answer X number. Did you find that often they didn't answer them all? Like, did people just leave stuff blank, or do you think generally they did it?
Actually, you know what? Can I default this one to Brandon?
Okay. Brandon?
Brandon was the one who actually marked it. So
You're on mute.
You're muted, Brandon.
I'm on mute. The way, so I'm actually not sure because the way it was set up in Blackboard, they were only asked 5 questions. So I only saw their answers for 5 questions, because I think Holly set it up where all the questions were put in Blackboard and it randomly gave them 5. And so I'm not sure if the students completed the questions that they didn't do. But in seminar, I let them know that they wouldn't be able to know what questions they were going to do before going into the assessment in Blackboard. And so they should do them all. I know there were some students who just waited to see which questions they were going to be assigned and just did the work as the questions came up in Blackboard.
Okay.
But I let them know that if they did it in advance in a Word document, they could just copy and paste their answers into Blackboard and the test would be done super fast.
And how long did they have to do the test?
I think there was like a deadline for the assignment. It was like a Monday or Tuesday or whatever at midnight. And I don't think there was a time limit as long as they submitted it by that deadline. But I don't think there was a time limit.
Right. No, I didn't put a time limit on the questions. Just they could do one attempt, so they couldn't go in and out of it. But there wasn't, so they could have it open all day. There was no time limit on the actual time they could have it open.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So, yeah, I think in terms of the marks, most of them did pretty well. Whether they did all of the questions or not, I don't know. A lot of the questions do build on one another though. So if they did skip some, they wouldn't necessarily be able to answer the next ones properly or very well. So my hope is that they would do all of them in order to get to the point where they're able to answer them properly. And I did, the way I randomized them is that I did try to say, okay, they would get a few of the really easy questions. They would get one of the random easy questions, and they would each get one of the really hard questions, right? So I sort of picked them out in that way to set that up. So that's one of the ways that I use the case studies in the seminars. And then I also wanted to show you another website, which I find is a great resource for, in biomed, they had a few labs that are sort of case study based. So this is a cardiology lab. And so this is one, so this is through the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. So they have this website called BioInteractive. And so this was kind of a case study in that they had a patient and they were basically pretending they were a doctor. They're doing a number of tests to try to diagnose their condition, but they need to learn about the conditions throughout the process. So I was actually surprised. I had one student who commented on that lab and said it's the favorite lab that they've done through their entire biology degree, which I was very surprised to hear, because we have a lot of face-to-face labs that we are very proud of. But she really enjoyed being able to do this one. So, so just a plug in for that website, because they have a lot of different types of resources, not just biomedical or physiology based. There's many different sciences there. So just to put a plug in for those ones as well. So those are the seminar case studies. And so I thought I'd show you problem sets. So they had 2 problem sets to submit, and I'll just show you the first one, which again isn't going to. There we go. All right, so in this one, this is what their problem set case study would look like. So again, it's a case study where there's multiple parts, and they have specific questions to answer relating to each part. So part 1 is about, again, I picked a common name, Mr. Smith. And so I won't bother going through and reading all of it, but there's really a story behind it. And then they have to sort of dig through that to answer the questions. So you can see with this one, there's 3 parts. They were given some lab values, and they really needed to apply what they had learned in class to be able to answer these questions. So these were worth a few more marks. These were worth 10% of their grade. So they should have spent, a bit of time working on them. So that's the problem sets. And then I thought I'd end with showing you how I formatted the final exam. And this was one I was quite pleased with how this went. So this is the first time I've done this in this course. I used it in another course as well for the final exam. So for the final exam, was case study based again. So they, at this point in time, they had lots of experience working through and analyzing case study type questions. And so they were assigned 2 case studies to complete. And the way that I did this is that they were randomly assigned 2 out of 4 possible case studies. And so again, I did this to try to prevent students from, sharing with one another too much. So if their friend has the same case study as them for one of them, they probably won't for the second case study. So that was my intention with that. And so there was 4 different case studies. They each submitted 2. They were a bit time consuming to mark. But again, I found that I was really pleased with the fact that they were very good at discriminating between the students who were strong in the course, who had put a lot of effort in, and those that had not. So because it really causes them to take what they've learned and really use that, as opposed to just remembering it. And especially I find with the remote assessments and the online assessments, I'm really not a fan of asking them questions where they can look up the answer in their notes really quickly. I think because most of the time they will, and rather than actually learning and understanding the material. So by using these cases, they do need to understand the material in order to answer the questions. So they were given 1 week to do these and submit them at the end of the semester. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, yeah.
I do have a question. When you had them submit it, did they submit it during exam period, or did you have them submit it before? So during exam?
They submitted it during the exam, and actually what I did is I had a few days where a little range of days where I wanted it to be due, and so I sent out a poll to the class and said, okay, which day works the best for you? And I took the majority, who said, of course, the last day that I offered them, not
Yeah.
surprisingly, and made it due on that day. So that was sort of my comfort range. And then that way they could look at what their exam schedule was like and decide, you know, which one they would prefer. And I had them rank them as well. So not just say which one they prefer, but which one they would rank first, second, and third. And then again, they all picked the last possible day, which I wasn't that surprised about either. So,
Okay.
yeah, was during the final exam period.
Cool.
All right, any other questions?
I've only got about 32 questions, Holly. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about one of the issues that you brought up early in your talk here. You talked about how you prepare students for the case studies on the assessments, which I think is really key, right? Like, and I was wondering if you could just spend a little bit of time talking about that, but also how you use case studies in early year courses, right?
Sure.
I think you mentioned that as well, that you use case studies throughout all the courses, and I know you teach anatomy to hundreds of students. So I was wondering if you could pick up on that one as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, well, so to your first point about the scaffolding. So for this class, the scaffolding is in the form of some questions during lecture. So just ones where I'm trying to get them to think that way, but there's not a lot riding on it in terms of marks for them. And then there's also in the seminar background where, again, there's a lot more discussion between them and their classmates in working on the seminar assignments. So again, it's more getting them comfortable with the idea of really critically analyzing the story that's associated with the case study. And then they kind of builds, and then the problem sets are the next part, which are worth a little bit more in terms of their grades. But by that time, they've done some seminar work, getting used to the case studies. They've seen a few within the lectures, and so they are more comfortable with using that. And then the advantages as well is that I have had a lot of these students in my first year courses. So they have seen case studies before then. So it's not a completely new thing to them. If nobody else has used them up until that point, they have at least seen them in the first year courses when they were taking anatomy or physiology, because I use them in both of those courses. So in both of the first year courses, I use the case studies in various ways. So in the anatomy class, for example, the way that the labs are set up is that they will go around to various stations. So for example, if 1 week they're learning about bones, they'll go around to various stations learning about different bones. One of those stations will be a case study station. So what we did, so 2 years ago, it was in lab where they did this case study where they were pretending that they were in forensics. So this was one more geared towards the forensic students. They were digging up some bones. They needed to identify the bones. Then they needed to figure out, okay, how old was this individual? How tall was this individual? So that was sort of a case study story based around these bones that they supposedly found. And then last year with the remote learning, we adapted that a little bit in that Debbie, the lab demonstrator for the course, went outside and took some beautiful pictures of these bones to try to bring it online and make it something that they could do, because they did really enjoy that case study. And again, it was a way for them to apply what they had learned in terms of identification of the bones. So that's one way I use it in the first year course. The physiology course, which comes after the anatomy course, in that class, the students, one of their assignments is actually to create their own case study. So I will give them examples of a case study, And they do find it a little bit difficult, but I think they do get a lot of guidance. They usually meet with the TAs ahead of time to go through what their ideas are. But in the end, their job is to create their own case study. So depending on the course, if it's the face-to-face course, they will present their case study as a group to their lab section. If they are in the online course, they usually will present their case study as a voice thread online. Or this year, I completely took out the group component because with 700 students, I was not brave enough to try to manage that. And so they're just submitting a written version of their case study. But again, this again causes them to apply what they've learned to make up their own story. And they also have to create some of their own discussion questions, so some thought-provoking questions about their story.
I think that what you've pointed to there is so important. And I'm thinking about my own courses and how I can do this better when I teach, is preparing students for the assessments we're going to give them. Right. And they have that practice opportunity, it sounds like, in first year and in fourth year. So in these low stakes areas where they can get a sense of what that assessment's like. So they're not surprised by the difference between what happens in class and the difference in what they're actually, in how they're actually performing or what they're asked to do in an assessment. I'm going to take that one forward with me. Holly, because I've been so interested in this, and it's something that Brandon and Dana certainly alerted me to, and you and I talked about, but I'm thinking a lot about the anatomy course that you teach as well, right? I know you introduced us to the fourth year course, but the first year course is an anatomy course. And when I think of anatomy, I think, gosh, that must be a lot of memorization.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
a kind of course that's sort of geared towards that. Right? And a kind of discipline or a kind of subject matter. And I understand and very much appreciate what you're saying, how you use case studies to get them to apply that knowledge. But how do you help students with that active memorization, that all the, I'm sure, the names that they have to figure out for all the parts of the body or for all the pieces of anatomy? How do you help students through that process?
Well, for the anatomy course especially, I give them a lot of work. Because to me, the best way for them to learn is through seeing and it in many different forms. So they have the webcasts where we will go through, a specific anatomical system. They will have a lab where they're able to actually see it and, get their hands on and play with some models and really pick up some bones and look at things like that. I also have some online assignments which are available through their textbook with McGraw-Hill, where they're able to, organize things. I really try to give them as many tools as possible. So a lot of these assignments are weighted very low. And there's a lot of flexibility. So it might be like the best 7 out of 10 count, or in some cases, the best 6 out of 10 count. So there's a lot that I throw at them. And so by making it flexible, my hope is that when they're having a really tough week, or when, it just isn't working for them this week, they don't stress about getting it done on time, but hopefully they'll still do the work. Another one of my favorites is I call it their creation assignment for anatomy, which is one where they get to pull out their Play-Doh. And they have to create something. So they need to make a structure, something we're learning about that week. They usually put it on a piece of paper, they label it. Some of them get very, very creative and submit these amazing, models. Some of them are very hard to discern, which is what mine would probably look like. But the point is that they generally represent what they've been learning that week. And it's another way of sort of getting them to take what they've learned and do something with their hands with it. So That's another example of something that I'll do for that class. Again, another way of learning it, but not really high stakes. Those aren't worth a lot of marks. And I always tell the students they're not worth a lot of marks. Don't spend 5 hours trying to make a beautiful model, which is really hard for some of the artists who have trouble submitting something that isn't beautiful. But again, it's just another way for them to use what they've learned. And those are pretty easy in terms of marking as well for the TAs.
Do you give them memorization strategies?
Memorization strategies.
I guess I'll sort of put all my cards on the table. One of the reasons why I'm asking is because Dana had said one of the things that you do in your class, and I wanted to check this out, is you have students share how they're memorizing pieces of anatomy with the rest of the students.
I know. Yes, I know what you're getting at now.
Okay.
So one of their assignments is on the discussion board. And again, not worth a lot of marks, but one of the things that they can do is share one of their anatomy study tools. So, so they have to make 2 posts through the semester. Most of the students will find other study tools as they're working through the course, they just will. So this is an opportunity for them to share the ones that they found really useful. And it's an opportunity for the other students to be able to go into that discussion board and say, okay, I'm having a really hard time figuring out how to remember this. So what are some tools that the other students in the class have used? So they can go in and see the other posts that were made by their classmates and use some of those tools themselves for study purposes. And in addition to that actual assignment, then there was also a discussion board and Q&A sessions with the TAs where they could come in and share their experiences as well. So, so in that way, they could build upon that. And then as well, I know that with Dana, we had an OLSA rep who also helped with some of like just memorization tips and study tips and stuff like that. So students could contact that rep for some of that advice as well.
How do you made mention at the beginning of your presentation of how much more work it is to mark case studies. How have you made that marking more manageable for yourself or for TAs?
So let's see. I try not to make the assignments too long. I do try to put a limit. Not all students respect this limit, but I do try to put a limit on the length that they're allowed to answer. So for the anatomy case study that I mentioned, the dem bones, one of the things that we did for that is I was able to set up, when they submit their answers, I set it up like a test in Blackboard. And so a lot of the answers could be automatically graded, so that only a few of the questions actually needed to be graded by the TAs, not all of them. So that helped to cut down on the workload in terms of marking of those. In terms of, I showed you an example of a problem set. So on those problem sets, there actually isn't too many questions. So I try to make them good questions, but not a lot of questions. I'll put it that way. And then, oh, sorry.
No, keep going. I have one more. I thought of a follow-up, but you keep going if you.
And then in terms of organization, I just tried to account for it at the very beginning of the course. I spend a lot of time sitting down and really doing all of the calculations for the hours and the marking, and then I can use that to adjust the assignments accordingly. So if I want this assignment to be 20 minutes to mark, I'll make sure that it shouldn't be more than 20 minutes per student. I mean, even that, hopefully they're usually not 20 minutes, but I will decide on that, and I will sort of allocate responsibilities at the very beginning of the course. So for example, if Brandon's the TA, even with this semester, he knows, okay, I'm marking students from A through this, and somebody else is marking these students. So by trying to really do all of those calculations at the beginning of the semester, I can plan to make sure that they're able to meet that, the hours I've got, basically. And so that's how I do that.
And just
What's the feedback like? Is it they get a grade, they get written comments back, they get what kind of, I'm trying to think about what I am able to share with other people to say, not that Holly's do it so you can too, just here's an example that has worked well for other people. How might that also work for you?
Right. Well, the extent of the feedback usually depends on the TA that's marking it. I do encourage them to give enough feedback so the student knows how they can improve on the question next time. I do, not always, but sometimes have a rubric that the TAs can use. So then the students can see that after the fact to get an idea of the marking. And then again, any of the students who want to explore it further or have questions, I do encourage them to contact the TA or myself as well. Usually I tell them to contact the TA first because they're the one that marked it. So they're going to be the best at answering in terms of where the marks went or, didn't happen. But they do have the opportunity to get a lot of feedback. I don't release answers because I know if I do that, I won't be able to use it again. So it's more that they're able to get as much feedback as they are willing to try to get.
Well, in pathophysiology, the one problem set I graded, the answer sheet, like some of the questions were, what are the 3 symptoms of X disease? And so that's a really easy question to answer because I had a list of the symptoms and I just had to cross-reference that the students put 3 right ones. So that's kind of easy to mark. And then the more open-ended questions, it was like, if they don't have a prediction, you take this many marks off. If they don't have X, Y, or Z, you take this other many marks. And so it's all kind of broken down. So even though it's an open-ended question, the question's broken down into the different expectations. And then I'm able to easily say to a student, well, you had to mention this symptom, and because you didn't, I had to take a mark off. So that became really easy kind of on the back end.
Okay. I think it's all super fascinating, Holly. I admire sort of the way in which you've met the challenge of teaching courses that depend on rote memory, finding interesting ways for the students to tackle those issues, and also manage large classes. I think that's no small feat. So